Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
Stories to Listen to When You Drive, Volume 8, Story 1. My friend called one evening and was very upset about a relationship gone bad. I suggested that we go for a drive and talk. We drove aimlessly through the mountains talking, and at one point passed a pickup truck sitting maybe 20 feet off the road in a field of tall grass about a mile from a rural bar. We drove on for some time, paying little attention to where we were, when suddenly the road dead-ended into a hill. There was no dead-end sign, and despite being very familiar with the area, neither of us could figure out where we were and why a paved road would suddenly just stop at the foot of a hill. It was dark, and if we had been going very fast, we would have plowed into the hill. We turned around, and after driving for a while, eventually got back onto a familiar road, and now, coming from the other direction, again passed the bar and then the pickup truck in the field. Whereas we had been preoccupied with conversation the first time we passed the truck, one of us now said, "Hey, wasn't that truck there before? It looks like the interior light is on. It was not on before. Maybe we should see if they need help." We turned around, drove back, and stopped the car. At this point, we were directly across from and probably 20 or 25 feet from the truck. As I said, the interior light was on. A man was sitting in the passenger seat, looking down at what appeared to be a map. A woman was sitting with her back against the passenger door, looking in the direction of the man in the driver's seat. Neither moved or even glanced toward us when we stopped in clear view. My friend rolled down the driver's window in our vehicle, stuck his head out the window, and stood up on the car seat so that he was half in, half out of the car, looking across the top of it, and yelled, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Neither of the clearly illuminated people in the truck moved or even looked at us. My friend yelled again. No reaction. I then noticed that there were no tracks leading from the road through the tall grass to where the truck was sitting. My friend started to get out of our car to walk over to the truck. Suddenly the hair stood up on the back of my neck, and I yelled, "It's a trick!" and grabbed the waistband of my friend's pants and literally pulled him into the car. I said, "I don't know how I know, but it's a trick." We drove away, and we left the people who were still sitting as if in a trance. We talked all the way home about how bizarre it was. Weeks later, we were sitting at my kitchen table talking to another friend about something entirely unrelated to this, when it suddenly popped into my mind, and I said, "Remember the people in the truck?" My friend responded that he did, and that it was very strange that neither of us had remembered it until that moment. Believe me, this doesn't sound half as strange as it really was. No, I haven't seen any more trance people. Story number 2. The first story, or the first experience I had, took place when I was turkey hunting with my dad on our 80-acre plot in the middle of 800 plus acres of Wisconsin woods. I was probably 15-ish at the time, and we had spent a few days in our old hunting cabin putting in full days of hunting and shooting the bull. It got dark, and we were eating dinner from the wood stove, oil lights burning bright. Every once in a while we'd open up the door to hoot at the great horned and barred owls just outside. The crickets and little frogs were usually about deafening. Then it got quiet enough for us to look at each other. Something had changed. Dad took care to teach me the ways of the woods, so my senses were keen that way, like his. After a bit of his silence, we heard this god-awful sound. It sounded like midnight during a full moon in the psych ward. Screaming and howling and laughing and random humanish noises from just up the gravel road. The ravings of mad people. The nearest house was over a mile away through very thick woods. The hair went up on both our necks, and we pondered the shotguns and locked the doors. Didn't see hide nor hair of the cause of the noise. We tried to tell ourselves it was coyotes later, but having heard coyotes before, it just doesn't sit right with me. I still get goosebumps. There were a lot of times that I was out deer hunting with a nice, thick bed of snow, and the "this isn't right" feeling would peer out at me from the blackness of the cedar swamp. It's a hell of a thing when a place can be all but black, despite the light of dawn and a blanket of snow. I don't go through there unless I've got a gun, as much as I love it during the day. They say the land remembers its history. I often wonder what that place remembers. Next story. The house I grew up in was from the late 1800s and haunted in very real ways. When my mom was a kid, sleeping in the bedroom that became mine, she would talk about the singing lady who sang lullabies to put her to sleep. The singing lady went away when the bedroom's walls were painted pink. When I was a teen, I'd regularly stay up real late on the computer with all the lights out. The computer desk faced the walkway that went upstairs to all the bedrooms, so I'd see anyone coming or going and hear them coming down the steps. The monitor was too high to see over, but I could see on either side. One night, I'm there surfing the web and I see my sister round the banister and I said, "Hey, what you doing up?" And I got that wrong feeling. She walked behind the monitor and didn't come out from behind the monitor. I figured she was trying to creep me out and was succeeding, so I got up and said, "Not funny, dingus," and looked around the front of the desk, and no one was there at all. I was one of those teens who got into the whole communing with spirit thing without being very educated on the safe ways to do it. It's arguable if there are safe ways to do it, but anyway, over a period of time, very odd things happened in my room, and the logical part of me really hopes that it was my sister pulling stuff on me, but she seemed just as scared as I was. One night, I go up to my room to bed, and my 4 feet tall, 4 foot wide, heavy wooden dresser was tipped over completely, the room torn apart and stuff laying everywhere. Something like that so large would have made a hell of a noise, but no one had heard a sound. The wrong feeling was heavy in the room, and my back and legs just went stiff trying to make myself go in. The dresser sat next to a wall and would have to be either be pulled or pushed with a lot of force. My mom yelled at both of us for trying to pull something on her when I told and showed it to her, and we cleaned up and tried to tell ourselves it was the cat or something that got behind the dresser. Another night, close to then, I had just decided to go to sleep and turned out the light with one of the cats sitting on my chest. Then it got cold, and the wrong feeling swept over me, and I shut my eyes tight. There was something hovering over my bed, parallel to my body, just above me. We could have touched each other. The cat started freaking out and backing herself under the covers, and she hated being covered normally. I clamped my eyes shut, feeling like if I saw what it was or looked in its eyes, it would have me. I held the silver cross I still wear around my neck and prayed for protection, and it passed. I could feel it get up and go away, and after a while I felt like I could open my eyes again. Somewhere also in this time period, a demonic face appeared on my sister's wall in some kind of glow in the dark paint, which we had. But whenever you paint with that stuff, whether you thin it out or not, you always see brushstrokes or marks from your fingers. This looked like it was just part of an underlying paint, like an oil stain that seeps through. It would never glow under black light and seemed picky on the nights that it would choose to glow. After that, I read every spiritual book I could on how to thoroughly cleanse a house and keep out the creepies. Nothing has happened since then that I knew of, though my sister still talks to the inhabitants of the basement, and my ex-husband, the son of a shaman, still swears that the swamp behind the house was a place nature decided things would go to die. I spent a lot of time in that swamp, hunting and fishing as a kid, but only during the daytime. The wrong feeling washed in like a tide from the center of it at night. Next story. It was about 2003, and a couple buddies from my college geology program and I made our way to a truly deserted, unnamed canyon in Red Rock Country, some 70 miles south of Moab, Utah. This wasn't another run-of-the-mill camping trip, though. We were returning to look for what we thought might be a completely articulated dinosaur skeleton we had spotted during one of our field trips earlier the previous year. We had kept the find a secret, hoping to return when the weather got better to excavate it. Everything was going well. I successfully got my Pathfinder several miles down the super narrow canyon we had hiked during our field trip. We were probably the first people to get a vehicle that deep into the canyon in years. We navigated the trackless sandy floor of the canyon to a point where it opened up just enough to park and make camp. The weather was unseasonably mild for March, and we took our time setting up camp in the warm early spring sun. We didn't have enough daylight to make for the dinosaur location that afternoon, so we decided to take what turned out to be a short but gnarly hike up one of the little side canyons from our camp location. It was amazing. After 3/4 of a mile of scrambling across, around and under the massive sandstone boulders that lay in our path, the little canyon suddenly opened into an enclosed amphitheater rimmed with at least 24 abandoned Anasazi Indian cliff dwellings. The ruins were so pristine, it was as if the residents had left only moments before we arrived. There were scores of unbroken, elaborately painted pots, intact baskets, and complete grinding stone sitting on the floors of some of the pueblos. There were mud brick granaries with corn and beans still in them, hidden in coves above the canyon floor. I had and have never seen anything like it. To make the whole scene even more surreal, there appeared to be recently burned wood charcoal in the fire pit in the center of the main kiva. It felt like we were trespassing a home, not investigating a 1,000-year-old archaeological site. We explored the place until the last orange rays of daylight turned the surrounding cliffs the color of fire, and we reluctantly made our way back to camp. We cooked our tinfoil dinners and sat by the fire, watching the Milky Way as it crossed the night sky, hatching schemes for global domination until we all crawled into our tents for the night. At about 1 a.m., I woke up scared. My heart was pounding out of my chest. I'd been dreaming about Indians, fire, and drums. I know it doesn't sound scary as I describe it, but the imagery was both super abstract and incredibly terrifying. I sat up in my bedroll. It was dead, quiet. Not so much as a breath of wind stirred outside my tent walls. And where the sky had been bright with the moon and stars before, it was now completely dark. It had also gotten much, much colder. I sat there for a few minutes listening, convincing myself it had just been a dream. Finally my pulse slowed and I laid my head back down on the pillow. That's when I heard the drumming. It was a slow, regular, simple beat that didn't vary at all. I sat up again and tried to figure out where it was coming from, but all went quiet again. I repeated this cycle a few times until I realized I could really only hear it when my ear was close to the ground. Somehow the ground was conducting the sound better than the air. The drumming slowly quickened and intensified. At some point it became audible without having to put my ear to the ground. I had completely forgotten about my friends, so it startled me to hear one of their voices pierce the darkness. Our conversation went something like this. Friend. Charles, you awake? Yeah, I'm awake. You hear that drumming? Yeah, I hear it. Where's it coming from? And I replied, how the should I know? Dude, let's get the hell out of here. Where are we gonna go? We're in a 20-mile-long slot canyon in the middle of nowhere. I've got my AK and 3 40-round magazines. We're better off right here. Do you think you'll be able to shoot them? What do you mean? Dude, what if they're not living? Indiscernible grumbling. Just don't leave your tent. We listened to the drumming, mixed with the occasional discernible howl, for the better part of 4 hours. It subsided just before dawn, and we emerged from our tent to nearly a foot of new snow. This is why it had become so cold and so dark, and possibly why the ground conducted the sounds of the drums better than the air. We didn't even attempt to get to the dinosaur site that day. The sun had fairly well melted the snow by late afternoon, and we bugged out as soon as it was humanly possible to do so. During the drive out of the canyon, one of my buddies, and we'll call him John, and I discussed what we thought the drumming was. Our other friend didn't so much as stir all night. He woke up completely oblivious to the whole scene. John was convinced we heard something supernatural, or at least supernatural beings, past residents of the site we had discovered coming back to scare the hell out of us. John also wears Birkenstock sandals, burns incense, prays next to crystals, etc. I didn't have an explanation. The canyon eventually dumped us out into the Navajo Indian reservation, and we stopped at a trading post to get some snacks and relieve ourselves. The Native American shop owner seemed friendly, if not a little surprised to see three pale faces this far into Navajo territory. So I asked him about the canyon and about the beautifully preserved ruins there. He looked visibly upset that we knew about the ruins, and he asked if we had taken anything from the site. Of course we hadn't. He then told us that it was a very sacred site and that its people still used it for ritual purposes. He asked us never to go back, and he begged us never to tell anybody where it was. I've intentionally left a description of the area and this story vague. I asked him if any of his people were up there the night before, and he said that he didn't think there had been. Apparently they knew it was going to snow when the National Weather Service didn't. He then told us that strange things were known to happen up there. After telling him about the drumming, the howling, etc., he just smiled and said, "That happens sometimes up there." I'm not sure what that means. Perhaps I don't want to know what that means. Next story. My wife was backpacking years ago with her boyfriend at the time. It was dark and they were heading back to the car. On a break, they noticed the light of a small flashlight about 100 yards behind them on the trail. They didn't think much of it, assuming it was another hiker, and kept going. After about an hour, they took another break and noticed the light again, but this time closer. It also seemed like the person with the flashlight was trying to cover it. They noticed that the flashlight would stop moving when they stopped. This started to freak them out, and they wanted to get out of there. They kept moving. It would notice the light behind them getting closer. They got to the end of the trail and noted it was now about 20 yards behind them. Her boyfriend yelled, "Run!" And they took off for the car and scrambled to throw everything in and get it started. They spun out of there and noticed that the flashlight was now coming off the trail into the parking area. But they just kept moving and floored it out of there. No other cars were parked at the trailhead. This was around the Appalachian Trail in southwest North Carolina. Years later, a serial killer was arrested who had killed several hikers in the general area of Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina. And they have no idea who it was. But generally, someone doesn't stalk you on the trail unless they have bad intentions. Maybe the guy was just getting his thrills following them from a distance with no intent to make contact or harm them. But every time she tells me that story, I get really creeped out. And since then, she's also afraid of camping out unless we have a group that's armed. Next story. I was about 14 or 15, many moons ago, and sitting in my bedroom floor working on a model airplane. I still remember, since it's in a box in my basement right now. But anyway, I've been working on this model all day with only bathroom breaks, determined to finish it that day no matter what, since I had too many half-built kits laying around. I live with my grandparents, and earlier in the day, my grandmother, the only other one at home at that time, had called me from the kitchen saying she had made me a sandwich and left it on the counter. My back was to my bedroom door, but we had cheap carpeting. You know, the kind that crunches when you walk on it, so it would be impossible to sneak down the hallway without me hearing it. Anyway, I yelled, "Uh-huh," or something like that, and another hour or two passed. I very distinctly felt 2 taps on my right shoulder from behind. So instinctively I figured my grandmother had wandered in to tell me to take a break. No one was there when I turned. It was then I realized I didn't hear anyone coming down the hall. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe my shirt had settled, and sat back down to get back to work. No sooner had I got settled, I very clearly again felt a tap, tap, tap on my shoulder, like someone was trying to get my attention. This time, I stood up and went down the hall to find Granny. She was in her bathroom in the other end of the house, and no one else was home. I figured that was a good excuse to take a break and went and ate that sandwich. Next story. We grew up out in the pucker weeds at a fishing lodge that was the last building on the road before it left the river for 30 miles or so. Also the first place anyone coming downriver would see. The rule when our folks were gone was my 2 sisters and I had to be in the same building. Nobody was to be alone. One night, Mom and Dad were in town for something. Guess I was about 15. One sister is a year and a half younger, the other another year and a half younger yet. Those two knotheads got in a fight. Littlest sister started making a batch of cookies in the lodge kitchen, and the other one decided to go to our cabin of residence and take a shower. I had a choice. Couldn't be with both. I went to my room to read. After a few minutes, I heard the lodge door, which was 30 yards away, slam, and that sister running hard and screaming. I met her at the cabin door, pistol in hand, 'cause whatever she was screaming about, she was serious. She said she'd heard footsteps overhead in the upstairs portion of the lodge, above the kitchen. I wasn't sure 'cause that old building creaked, but if a creak moves rhythmically down the hall, odds are it is someone. Not sure what else to do. I called Grandma, who lived a quarter-mile away. She drove down from her house, and we went upstairs, and we checked around. We figured we had someone cornered in one particular room, but we couldn't see under the bed without turning our backs on the closet and vice versa. Pretty tense situation. We talked loud about calling the cops and letting them check it out and then backed out of there. The next morning, there were sandy footprints heading down the hallway to the back exit. So yeah, we did indeed have an intruder. Next story. One time my father was walking across the porch in the dark and, despite not liking cats, decided to pet him in passing since he just put food out in their dish. Petted one cat, petted the next cat, petted the next cat, petted the next cat, then stood up and took a few steps before realizing we only had 3 cats. So he stepped near them, reached up, and pulled the chain to turn the porch light on. There was a spotted skunk with its nose pushed in the chow dish with the cats. No problem. The cats didn't mind, so the skunk apparently assumed this was part of the feeding ritual. Next story. My family used to do a lot of primitive camping when I was growing up. You know, spend 2 hours setting up a 150-pound tent with blueprints on how to put all the poles together properly. Dad never read them, which is why it took 2 hours. To say the least, he was never a happy camper when he finally finished putting it up. On this trip, we were somewhere in the lower end of the land between the lakes in western Kentucky. 4 of us went in on his '66 Chevy step-side pickup loaded with gear. The road leading in was rough, with a steep hill right before we got to the campsite. It was miserably hot and humid for the first 2 days, and frankly, not much fun. Late on the 3rd night, we were awakened by distant lightning flashes. As it grew closer, we started hearing the thunder, and the wind began picking up a bit. Dad told us to go back to sleep, but I could tell he was nervous. He got up and went outside with the rest of us close behind him. As we looked across the lake to the southwest, the lightning display was spectacular, but we knew that it meant trouble. It started raining, and he told us all to get back in the tent, which we did. The storm hit with a vengeance, with the wind threatening to blow our tent away with us in it, and the lightning seemingly popping every tree around us. Mom made the mistake of touching the ceiling of the tent with her hand to keep it from sagging down on her, and immediately the water started pouring in. Dad was livid with her, and we all ran for the truck and squeezed in. Kentucky Lake is pretty big, but the waves that were crashing ashore in the little bay were absolutely monstrous and swamped our boat. But the lightning was so intense that we didn't dare try to rescue it. Hail put several cracks in the windshield and dents in Dad's truck. I thought he was going to start crying. About after 20 minutes of hell, it suddenly became calm. It was a surreal calm that just plain felt wrong. We started hearing a sound like continuous thunder, which got louder and louder. It was then that lightning flashes illuminated a tornado coming down towards the lake, and it was headed in our direction. This wasn't a little rope, it was huge. Dad fired the truck up and attempted to get up the steep hill, but the rain had made it impossible. All we could do was sit there and hope the tornado didn't hit us. Just as we knew we were about to die, it got real quiet again. The tornado had lifted over us, but the roar started again as the tornado touched back down on the other side of the big hill. We had survived, but we were now stuck therewith the road blocked by trees, a sunk boat, and a tent that had been demolished by the wind and hail. A higher power was looking out for us that night, and we all knew it. We ended up really roughing it for another 4 days before we could get out, but it was the closest that I can ever remember our family being as a kid. Next story. Back in 2012, on a large undeveloped parcel in the Salt Lake Valley, I was sent to oversee the excavation of a series of test pits for a geotechnical investigation my company was doing for the owner of the property. I'd previously done a little recon of the site and a few high-angle aerial photos, but all of them had failed to show quite how heavily wooded the property was. The entire parcel was an absolute tangle of trees and brush that looked like it had been transplanted from the Olympic Peninsula. My excavator operator and I couldn't see any more than 10 or 12 feet through the mess. Getting his track hoe down the steep embankment from the road, then into and through the trees, was certain to be an experience. We began walking the perimeter of the property and finally found a single track trail that appeared to cut through the trees, and we decided to attack the forest from that point. My operator built a dirt ramp down the steep slope and into the forest and shut off his machine when he reached the bottom, so that we could put our heads together for a minute and figure out where in this jungle we were going to dig our test pits. I was already a little on edge because I knew that transients, junkies, drug dealers, and even prostitutes frequented undeveloped spots like this within the city. Beyond that, though, the woods just seemed creepy. They were abnormally thick for a Utah forest. I was seeing species of trees and understory I had never seen in Utah before. Broadleaf maple, blackberry, sequoia, and western red cedar, obviously planted there, all thriving in a way they had no business doing in a semi-arid climate like the Salt Lake Valley. Something wasn't right with the place, and it was gnawing at me a little bit, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Needless to say, I nearly jumped out of my skin when, after my operator had shut down his track hoe, we heard movement from several directions at once, speeding away from us through the dense foliage. Though, just as startled as I was, my operator was convinced it was just a few deer we had spooked as we made our way down the slope. I wasn't so certain. As someone who has hunted and observed deer in the state of Utah practically since birth, it seemed strange to me for deer to be so far inside the city this time of year. Further, mule deer tend to leap and crash through thick vegetation when they're spooked. The movements we had heard seemed far smoother, steadier than that. At that point, I was strongly considering calling the cops and having them clear the 30 acres for us before we moved in. My operator, however, called me a few chosen words, reached into a bag at his feet, produced a Springfield XD, which is a .40 Smith & Wesson, in its holster, and handed it to me. "There," he said, "you feel better?" Indeed, I felt much better. So, pistol on hip, I hopped on the track hoe and we proceeded noisily into the forest, downing trees, clearing brush, generally leaving a 12-foot wide swath of destruction in our wake. We arrived at the first test pit location, and my operator shut down his machine again to grease some fittings before he started digging. We didn't hear movement when he shut down this time. Instead, we heard voices. Children's voices. Somewhere just beyond visual range, probably no more than 60 or 70 feet, we could hear children talking, playing, laughing. Creepy. We both froze, listening as the voices began moving away from us in the direction we had just come. We didn't follow them, partly because I had just pooped myself, but mostly because I wanted no part of stalking kids through a big creepy forest in the middle of an industrial commercial part of the city. The nearest residential neighborhood was a good 4 or 5 blocks to the south. A few moments later, the voices had moved on, and my operator commenced digging the first test pit. About 3.5 feet down, I discovered why the forest was so freakishly healthy. A near-surface clay layer was preventing surface water from percolating any further through the native sand, effectively creating a perched aquifer that the plants were exploiting to wonderful effect. Excited by my discovery, I forgot momentarily about all the weirdness. My operator filled in the test pit, and we moved on to the second location. We dug and filled the second test pit without incident, and began moving to the third location, but my operator stopped the track hoe suddenly and shut down the engine. The moment the racket of the motor and the metal tracks had ceased, we heard big things moving through the trees and undergrowth in every direction around us. My hand instinctively reached for the pistol on my hip, but whatever was out there, they were once again just beyond visual range in that crazy thick forest. I turned and asked my operator if he had seen what they were. Pointing his finger at the ground in front of the machine, he said something like, "No, but I saw that." I looked off the front of the track hoe to the area he was pointing at and observed what looked at first glance like a large pile of debris on the ground. On closer inspection, though, I could make out a couple of dirty chairs, a nasty-looking sofa, and several terrible-looking mattresses lying on the ground. There were also several sheets of beat-up corrugated plastic forming a rudimentary roof over all of it. I jumped off the machine to take a closer look, expecting to see evidence of recent inhabitation. After closer inspection, though, it was clear that nobody had been staying there since before the last winter. Leaves from the previous fall covered the chairs, sofa, and mattresses, and the garbage that lay strewn about was all partially buried in leaves and pine needles. Moreover, there were no footprints, human or animal, to be found in the soft soil. Whatever we had just heard, they weren't the inhabitants of this little shanty. We fired the track hoe back up and maneuvered around the hovel toward the next location. We operated without shutting down through the rest of the morning and into the afternoon. We wouldn't hear anything around us unless it was making noise more than our mechanical monster. We encountered several more hobo camps dotted throughout the woods, but none of them appeared to have been recently occupied. A bank of thick clouds rolled in about 2 p.m. By 2:30, a cold-soaking rain settled in, and by 3:30, snowflakes the size of silver dollars were falling out of the sky, blanketing the tops of the trees we were under. I was freezing, but with only one more test pit left to go, we pushed into the densest part of the forest and broke through a thick blackberry hedge into a derelict apple orchard. Standing in neat rows, the huge ancient apple trees were in full bloom. It was one of the most singular sights I have ever seen. These massive old trees covered in white blossoms, the shimmering emerald green orchard grass beneath them, the silver dollar-sized snowflakes decorating everything. It was absolutely stunning. My operator shut down his beast, and just as before, and just as I think we were both expected, we heard big things moving away from us through the forest in all directions. Then silence. We both sat there speechless for several minutes. I knew we were being watched, but my hand never reached for the holster at my side. Whomever or whatever was out there had ample opportunity to hurt us throughout the day if they had been so disposed. They clearly meant us no harm. I dismounted and walked around the orchard for a few minutes and stumbled across the foundation of an old house and the remains of a buried well. As near as I could tell, this was a pioneer-age homestead that probably hadn't been occupied in close to 100 years. There was no trace of modern garbage on the ground, no evidence that anybody had been there in years. I feel lucky to have seen this place, the forest, the orchard, the little homestead, this little paradise before it was bulldozed in the summer. My operator eventually fired up the hoe and finished digging and filling the last hole before moving out. I have no idea who or what we heard, or who or what followed us throughout the day, but I still speculate about who that was.